space travel, the final frontier. Humanity has come a long way in just the past century, from the Soviet Union launching the first man into space to the US landing the first ever humans on the moon. This is just the beginning. Our technology is advancing faster than ever, with private space companies like SpaceX and their ambitions for a future, including a manned mission to Mars. A future full of humans in space seems increasingly likely. How cool would that be, right? Humanity, us, traveling to other worlds, going where no one has gone before, expanding our abilities and knowledge on an unprecedented scale. It really is amazing to think about. Imagine being able to see these things for yourself, traveling through the beautiful abyss that is outer space, seeing other worlds, stepping foot in places no human has ever touched. It may not be as great as you think, however. Imagine you're invited to experience this for yourself. You are part of a crew set to land on Mars. Strapping yourself into your launch seat, all you can think about is your family and friends. All you can do is hope nothing goes wrong. One small error during the mission is the difference between seeing them again and not. Even if everything goes flawlessly, it will be years before you return. You turn your head and glance out the window. This is the last time you will see the surface of Earth, maybe forever. You feel a violent shaking and a pressure on your chest as the rocket launches. So far, so good. As you reach space, you can see the Earth slowly receding behind you. Everything you've ever known, now visible as a blue marble surrounded by blackness. You are now completely alone. The space all around you is devoid of any air, sound, and life. Your spaceship is just a metal cell you're locked inside, just a few inches between you and the void. This is just the beginning of your mission. As time passes, you start to notice changes in yourself. Your body is not made for these conditions. The human mind needs constant stimulation and social interaction, which, besides for your crew, you are completely deprived of. This leads to intense feelings of loneliness, depression, and reduced cognitive ability. Your body suffers too. The lack of gravity causes your bones to lose density, your heart to weaken, and your vision to get worse. While all of this happens to you, Mission Control expects you to stay mentally sound and perform many complex tasks requiring peak mental and physical performance. The worst part? You'll be living in these conditions for 9 months before you make it to Mars. If you take on a mission like this, you will look at death straight in the face. Space travel is absolutely terrifying. Humanity has always dreamed of the cosmos. Celestial bodies have been part of human culture from the very beginning. Ancient mythology had many stories to explain the sun, moon, and stars. But eventually, modern science would develop and our understanding of these bodies would increase. That would only drive our curiosity further. Long ago, people would discuss and write about human space travel even before it was seen as a real possibility. Jules Verne wrote one of the very first science fiction novels about space travel all the way back in the 1860s, titled From the Earth to the Moon. In the novel, 3 astronauts are launched to the moon. Now, this was long before missiles or rockets had been invented. To get people to space, you need a lot of speed. So, what Verne described in his novel was a giant cannon designed to launch humans quick enough to escape Earth and make it to the moon. What's impressive is Verne actually did some rough calculations as to what the cannon would need to get people to the moon. And considering the lack of data on the subject at the time, his calculations were pretty accurate. However, a space cannon wouldn't actually be feasible in reality due to the immense amount of energy that would be needed. And with that kind of acceleration force, the astronauts would be killed from the G's instantly on launch. Most of the novel describes the construction of this cannon. After the construction is completed, the 3 astronauts are successfully launched from the cannon into space, heading for the moon. But this is the end of the story. Verne leaves the fate of the characters inconclusive, which is a powerful way to make the readers imagine such a scenario in reality. This novel made a huge impact and inspired many later science fiction works. In 1880, the Pall Mall Gazette newspaper even described Verne's cannon as a spaceship. This was the first ever recorded use of that term. At the time, novels like From the Earth to the Moon were considered more of a fantasy story rather than something that could actually happen. It wasn't until decades later that human space travel seemed like a real possibility. July 29, 1955. The United States announces a plan to launch the world's first artificial satellite, hoping to be the very first nation to do so. Not even a week later, the USSR responds to the announcement, revealing their own plans to create the first satellite. The race was on. This would be the start of a 15-year period where more time, money, and effort was put into the research and development of spacecraft than at any other point in human history. This would be known as the space race. Both sides were making progress quickly. On October 4th, 1957, the USSR started with the upper hand by succeeding at launching the first ever artificial satellite into orbit, Sputnik 1. Just a month later, the USSR continued gaining their lead by launching the first life form bigger than a microbe into space, Sputnik 2, carrying the dog Laika. The US was now behind and needed to play catch-up. They managed to launch their first satellite, Explorer 1, a few months later in January of 1958. Now that both sides knew it was possible to launch a life form up there, the next goal was to put a man up there. After a few more years of research and development, the USSR managed to beat the United States by just 3 weeks when they launched Yuri Gagarin in the Vostok 1 spacecraft on April 12, 1961, the first man in space. He completed a full orbit of the Earth and landed an hour and 29 minutes later, followed by the US launching Alan Shepard aboard the Freedom 7 just a few weeks later on May 5th. This flight was suborbital, however, and lasted just 15 minutes and 28 seconds. These were just stepping stones, however, smaller battles in the larger war. To truly win the space race, one nation would need to use a combination of all skills and knowledge learned so far and do the impossible. Place a human on another celestial body, the moon. The US was behind and they knew it. It would take a miracle to beat the Soviets after being in second all these years. September 12, 1962. President John F. Kennedy stands at Rice University Stadium in Texas in front of a crowd of 40,000 Americans. The US knows they're not going to make it to the moon without the country's support. Kennedy delivers a speech. He talks about space as a new frontier, connecting this new frontier to the pioneer spirit so abundant in American history and culture. Hoping to inspire the American people, he speaks his famous line,
"We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too."
This speech resonated heavily with the American people. Kennedy set a goal that the US would put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. There was now about 7 years to make that happen, and these next 7 years would not go very smoothly. The US spent the first of these years developing the most powerful rocket ever created, the Saturn V. Testing began. On February 21st, 1967, the first manned mission of the Apollo program was set to launch. This mission was designed to test the Apollo Command and Service Module. However, it never flew. A month before the scheduled launch date, astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger B. Chaffee were conducting a launch rehearsal test when a fire broke out in the cabin. This fire would kill all 3 astronauts. They were unable to escape their cockpit due to the plug door hatch, which couldn't be opened due to the pressure difference between the cockpit and the outside. These 3 men were trapped in the fire with no way to save themselves. This mission was nicknamed Apollo 1 by the crew, and to honor them, NASA made that name official, and all future missions in the program used the name Apollo. This was NASA's first major disaster, and it set them back. All-man testing was halted for 20 months while issues were addressed. 1969. This year would mark the United States' last chance to put a man on the moon and fulfill the promise made by Kennedy 7 years earlier. Astronauts Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins were chosen to pilot the Apollo 11 mission with the goal of being the first humans on the moon. On July 16, 1969, all 3 astronauts boarded the Saturn V rocket and launched from Kennedy Space Center in Florida. After traveling through space for 3 days, the command module and lunar lander had made it to the moon's orbit. Astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin got into the lander while Michael Collins remained in the service module orbiting the moon. Together, the 2 astronauts descended to the lunar surface in the Sea of Tranquility. After a successful landing, Neil Armstrong would be the first human to ever step foot on another celestial body, speaking the famous quote,
"It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind."
This was a monumental achievement, not just for America, but for the entire world. The event was watched globally on TV by over 650 million people. The US had done it. They won the race. Space technology would continue to advance in the form of space stations, new space programs, and better technology like the Hubble Space Telescope to help us understand the cosmos. One of NASA's biggest goals following the Apollo program was to create a reusable spacecraft. This new program would end up causing the death of 14 astronauts, the Space Shuttle program. January 28th, 1986. The Space Shuttle Challenger prepares for its 10th mission. In the 24 previous Space Shuttle flights, no major issues arose. That would change today. Aboard the shuttle were 7 astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, a high school teacher picked by NASA's Teacher in Space program. Many around the world were excited to watch the very first teacher launch into space, including many students in classrooms to tune into this event live. The craft lifted off the launch pad with no issues. The world watched in wonder. No one was ready for what was about to happen. 73 seconds into Challenger's flight, the craft disintegrated, killing all 7 crew members on board. The cause was determined to be a failure of the O-rings designed to keep the pressurized gas sealed in the right booster, leading to an explosion and the loss of the space shuttle. Studies into the disaster lead to the belief that some crew members may have survived the initial explosion, but with no way to escape the shuttle, the craft would collide with the ocean at terminal velocity, killing any surviving members. This harrowing video shows Barbara Morgan, a teacher who was set to fly on the Challenger should Krista not be able to make it. This video shows her watching the launch.
Get down.
It's truly heartbreaking to see her go from excitement to absolute terror in the span of just a few seconds. This must have been devastating for her to watch. I can't even imagine what was going through her head at the time. NASA would shut down the Teacher in Space program shortly after this incident. What a terrible tragedy. The crew succumbed to a fate they had no control over. NASA did extensive research to try to prevent a disaster like this from ever happening again. Unfortunately, this would not be the last Space Shuttle disaster. On January 16, 2003, Space Shuttle Columbia launched from Kennedy Space Center on what was thought to be a standard research mission. Columbia and the other space shuttles were equipped with thermal tiles made of this porous silicone material on their exterior. These tiles were designed to absorb the intense heat sustained while re-entering the atmosphere. While there have been a few issues with these tiles in the past, no one could have predicted the extent of these problems on Columbia. During Columbia's launch, a piece of foam broke off the external tank, striking the left wing and knocking some of these thermal tiles off of the craft. NASA was aware of this. Once they got into space, the US Department of Defense reportedly offered use of an orbital spy camera to take photos of the damage. NASA would decline this offer. On February 1st, after 16 days in space, Columbia would begin its descent towards Kennedy Space Center. As the shuttle began to hit the atmosphere at nearly 25 times the speed of sound, Mission Control would begin to receive abnormal data. The temperature and tire pressure readings from the left wing aren't showing up. Columbia and Mission Control are working together discussing these issues when suddenly, all communication with the shuttle went silent. The loss of these thermal tiles on the left wing allowed atmospheric gases and massive amounts of heat to penetrate the shuttle. Mission Control lost all readings, and eventually the entire craft burned up in the sky. 7 lives were lost that day. What we can take away from the Space Shuttle program is that no matter how perfectly engineered a spacecraft may be, one small mistake is the difference between life and death. Out of the 355 astronauts that flew on a Space Shuttle mission, 14 would be killed, making the fatality rate nearly 4%. Looking through the history of space travel, we can already see the dangers associated with it. However, if humanity is ever going to be a spacefaring interplanetary species, we're just scratching the surface. Technology is still advancing and private companies are doing more and more every day. One day, humans are going to go further, much further. SpaceX has had their eyes on Mars for a long time now. Even though that seems like a logical next step, it's really a huge leap from what humanity has accomplished so far. The moon is a staggering 238,000 miles from Earth, and that's the furthest we have ever gone. Mars is over 500 times further than that, at over 120 million miles away. We've sent probes and rovers that far, but sending humans is an entirely new challenge. Humans are amazing creatures, but we're designed to live here on Earth, not out there. It goes against everything in our biology to leave our home. Spending that much time isolated away from everything and everybody you love causes a mental pain known only to the very few. One person who knows the pain isolation can cause is French geologist Michel Siffre. Siffre was very interested in human isolation and decided to conduct an experiment on himself. He would spend 2 months underground in a cave alone. Siffre began his isolation on July 16, 1962. He descended into the cave with no clocks, watches, calendars, or any way to tell the time. He was also deep enough underground there was no sunlight at all, no way to tell when days are passing. Imagine leaving the whole world behind and descending into a place like that, not seeing the outside for months, not feeling the sun on your skin, and not seeing any of your loved ones. Sounds terrifying. Siffre's main goal was to study how humans react when the only way to observe time passing was internally. There was a team outside of the cave monitoring the experiment. Siffre would call them when he woke up, when he ate, and when he went to sleep. He would also perform 2 tests each time he called the surface. First, he checked his pulse. Then, he would count from 0 to 120, trying his best to count 1 number per second. The crew was not allowed to contact Siffre, so he truly was completely isolated. The cave he was in had sub-freezing temperatures and extremely high humidity. Siffre says that his internal body temperature got as low as 93 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to cause hypothermia. It was an uncomfortable 2 months. He would pass his time by reading, writing, and studying an underground glacier in the cave with him. Siffre did not consciously keep a sleep-wake schedule, and over time it was discovered that his body would naturally go through a slightly longer day cycle at 24 hours and 30 minutes. But this discovery would prove that humans have a natural internal clock. Without any environmental factors, however, his sleep cycle did vary. Sometimes his cycle would last up to 36 hours. As time passed, Siffre noticed he was having trouble with his memories. In a Cabinet magazine article, he said, "I believe that when you are surrounded by night, the cave was completely dark with just a light bulb. Your memory does not capture the time. You forget. After 1 or 2 days, you don't remember what you've done a day or 2 before. The only things that change are when you wake up and when you go to bed. Besides that, it's entirely black. It's like one long day." Even though his body's cycle wasn't too different from a normal cycle, his conscious sense of time was surprisingly off. While calling the service and performing his count from 0 to 120, trying to count one number per second, he believed it took him 2 minutes to finish counting. It actually took him 5 minutes, meaning when he attempted to consciously keep track of time, it passed faster than he thought. His long-term sense of time was also extremely affected. When his crew retrieved him after the 2 months were up, Sifri thought it had only been a month. It's interesting how, depending on the situation, his sense of time was both faster and slower than the actual passage of time. 10 years later, Sifri would conduct a similar experiment, but this time spending 6 months alone in a cave. His sleep-wake cycle was even more varied this time, stretching anywhere from 18 to 52 hours. Sifri nearly lost his mind this time. He was extremely paranoid, utterly depressed, and hopelessly alone. When he began the experiment, he killed all of the rats in the cave with a pellet gun he brought along. But after the experiment progressed and these feelings of loneliness increased, he was desperate for companionship. Sifri found a rat that had survived. He tried to trap the rat with a casserole dish and instead accidentally crushed it. He wrote in his journal after this incident, "Desolation overwhelms me." This would be the last time Sifri attempted an experiment like this on himself. Astronauts on a long-term mission would be in a similar situation. One positive that Sifri didn't have to deal with is they won't be completely alone. They would still have to leave Earth behind and say goodbye to their closest loved ones, but at least they have a crew with them. This still doesn't fix the problems. They're still going to have their natural sleep-wake cycle disturbed, and they will suffer from declining mental health. NASA has said that of all of the astronauts that have spent long periods in space on the International Space Station, over 60% of them suffer from mental health issues. These astronauts aren't just sitting in a cave either. They are expected to perform complex tasks and always be willing and able to work. Almost all astronauts returning from missions say they suffer from cognitive impairment issues. And a study even shows that long stays in space can affect your mental cognition even up to 6 months after returning to Earth. The effect of isolation on astronauts cannot be ignored, but this is not the only thing they're going to have to deal with. They also have to deal with the lack of gravity. It's well documented that microgravity is unhealthy for the human body. Many of our body's processes rely on the downward pull of gravity here on Earth. Have you ever tried to hang upside down? All that blood rushes to your head and you get uncomfortable pretty fast. A similar thing happens to astronauts. Our bodies are designed to fight gravity to get blood all around our bodies. But we are still affected by gravity. In a standing or sitting position, blood will accumulate in your leg veins. In microgravity, this no longer happens. And with your heart not having to push against gravity, blood that's usually in your legs will spread more evenly across your body, especially accumulating in your head and face. Astronauts have said this feeling is similar to hanging upside down on Earth. They've even given it a name, puffy head bird legs. While this may be uncomfortable, it's really the least of their worries. Blood and cerebrospinal fluid are pushed against your eyes in microgravity, causing a condition known as spaceflight-associated neuroocular syndrome. The forces on the eye cause your eyeball to become deformed, most notably a flat spot on the back of the eye. This causes noticeably blurry vision for astronauts. Long periods of microgravity also cause a phenomenon called skeletal unloading. Human bones go through a natural process of shedding calcium into the bloodstream, while cells replace the lost mass. These effects typically cancel each other out and your bones stay healthy. In space, however, the lack of gravity means your bones are under a lot less stress than they're used to. The shedding process of releasing calcium continues, but new bone mass is not being created nearly as much. This leads to a massive decrease in bone density and strength, making the likelihood of a fracture or other injury much higher. The increased calcium in the blood also causes unpleasant side effects like kidney stones. These effects will typically go away relatively quickly after returning to Earth, but an extreme loss of bone density may be permanent, lasting the rest of an astronaut's life. It's not just your bones that are affected, your muscles will struggle in this environment too. Microgravity makes things easier for your muscles, which is actually a bad thing. If you or someone you know has had to stop using a muscle for a long period of time due to something like breaking a bone, then you probably know how weak the muscle becomes. It takes a lot of exercise to bring that muscle back to normal. Now, imagine that's happening to your whole body. Astronauts in space for a long period of time do exercise, but their muscle mass will still decrease. Another muscle that's affected is your heart. Your heart doesn't have to work as hard when not fighting against gravity, and this actually weakens your heart, causing it to shrink. After returning to Earth, your heart will be under a lot of stress as it has to reacclimate to the force of gravity. So let's say you do go on that 9-month mission to Mars. You will likely experience some, if not all, of these effects. So what can we do? There must be some way to make space travel healthier and safer. In the far future, a 9-month mission could be a short one. A trip to further out planets or even to another star could take years or even decades. So humanity should do what we do best: innovate. A lot of time, money, and effort will be needed, but many of these problems can be reduced or even removed. To counter isolation and feelings of loneliness, astronauts could go through training with a psychiatrist to prepare their mind for what they will experience. Better long-distance communication, allowing astronauts to talk to their loved ones face-to-face while on their mission, would greatly combat loneliness. More research into the human brain could help us understand what our minds need the most, so we can make sure space travelers prepare mentally and have what's most important. On missions spanning multiple years, having more astronauts could be beneficial by helping to create a sense of community among the crew. Exercise can help mitigate the effects of microgravity, but this doesn't solve the problem. The best case scenario for astronauts' health on a long-term mission is to get rid of the microgravity altogether. Many science fiction films do this by creating a circular spacecraft designed to spin while in space. This spin will create a downward force mimicking gravity. It's the same force you feel pulling you into the door when a car is turning. While this hasn't been done in space yet, a craft like this would greatly increase the health and well-being of the crew on board, and it's possible we'll see something like this implemented in a spacecraft soon. Who knows what kind of technology will be developed in the future? Many science fiction concepts, like cryosleep, teleporting, faster-than-light travel, seem to be just that, fiction. But just as Jules Verne's dreams of putting men on the moon came true, so can our dreams of today. Humanity as a whole has this honestly pretty strange desire to explore and conquer the unknown, and to see these places that no other soul has ever seen. From being the first person to cross the Atlantic by boat, to the first person to climb Everest, to even the first person on the moon, humanity is unstoppable. Even with these massive dangers, we continue. We just won't quit. Only time will tell what kind of technology will be created in the future, but I'm sure it's going to be truly amazing. As science fiction author Arthur C. Clarke said, any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic.